Madhav, I think you can start.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from. I just want to welcome everyone for the second day of this NSF-sponsored Prepare workshop. Our meeting yesterday went off very well. We received a lot of emails from participants that they enjoyed the sessions. I think today is going to be equally exciting, and we look forward to your participation like yesterday. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Professor Pulliam and Professor Simonsen, who are the panel leads for this particular panel and session, and let them take it from here. Go ahead, please.
Great, thanks, Madhav. I'm Juliet Pulliam. I'm the director of SACEMA, which is the South African Center for Epidemiological Modeling and Analysis. And my co-moderator is Lona Simonsen. Lona, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everybody. Nice to see so many faces that we know. I'm a professor of epidemiology and I head the Pandemics Research Center in Denmark. It's a pleasure to be here. I studied pandemics for the last 30 years and now this. So here we are.
I'm hoping you can see my screen. Can someone just confirm that for me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is the third session of the Lessons and Experiences on Viable Epidemic Response Strategies workshop. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. We are today speaking about global perspectives on modeling to support pandemic decision-making, and we have four fantastic speakers who will also participate in a panel discussion at the end of the session. So our four speakers are Professor Juliet Gog from the University of Cambridge in the UK, Professor Viggo Andreasen from just realized I don't know how to say that, Roskilde University in Denmark, Professor Thumbi Mwangi from the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and Professor Joseph Wu from Hong Kong University in Hong Kong. So as you can see, our Global Perspectives panel represents countries from around the world. And we've chosen these four countries largely because they represent very different contexts in which the epidemic unfolded, and we think that they can provide some interesting contrasts. So I'm showing here some summary statistics about the four different countries, and you can see that they vary in population size. So on the right-hand side is the 2019 population size, so the population size prior to the pandemic. You can see for each of the countries, there are different population profiles. So there are population pyramids, which is showing the number of individuals in different age groups, with the older age groups at the top and the younger age groups at the bottom. Females on the right-hand side in pink and males on the left-hand side in blue. And you can see that there's quite a lot of variation, particularly contrasting Kenya to the UK and Denmark, which are much more similar. And these differences, along with differences in socioeconomic patterns and government structures and trust in government, some of those factors that were discussed yesterday, all drove different responses to the pandemic. And these different responses that were taken through government action as well as through the actions of the population resulted in different outcomes for the COVID pandemic in these different contexts. And so the left-hand plot is showing the cumulative confirmed COVID-19 deaths per million population for each of these countries, and then South Africa added just for good measure. You can see that the trajectories are quite different, that the cumulative death toll is quite different, but also one thing that this really highlights to me is that there are differences in the observation processes in these different countries. And so South Africa here looks like it did relatively well, but if we were to look at, for example, excess mortality rather than confirmed COVID deaths, you would see that South Africa actually had a very bad epidemic compared to most of the other countries in the world. So that's just a little bit of context for the presentations. I'm now going to introduce the first speaker, who is Professor Juliet Gog. So I will stop sharing my slides, and Julia, if you want to go ahead and put yours up, go for it. So Julia Gog is professor of mathematical biology at the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics at the University of Cambridge. She's also the David N. Moore Fellow in Mathematics at Queen's College. Her research has focused mainly on the spread and evolution of infectious diseases, particularly influenza and more recently COVID. She has contributed to the scientific advice to the UK government during the COVID-19 emergency as a member of the modeling group SPI-M and as a participant of SAGE, which I believe stands for the Scientific Advisory Group on Epidemics. Julia is the co-lead of the Juniper Consortium, which brings together epidemiological research across several UK universities. I just want to say before I hand it over that if you have questions as Julia is speaking or anytime throughout the session, please just put them in the chat. We would appreciate if you could make them succinct so that they're easy for us to navigate as we go through the discussion session. And with that, I'll hand it over to Julia. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Can someone confirm if I'm muted or not?
We can hear you and we can see your slides.
I've got this really stupid thing. If I share my screen, I can't see my mute unmute button.
Okay.
But hopefully you can see my screen and hear me.
Yes. Amazing.
Right. I'm going to skim over a few topics and then maybe we can sort of pick up in questions and discussion which bits of that might be of most interest when we bring the four of our views together. So I was part of a group called SPI-M, and there was a phase in the UK I didn't need to tell anyone what that meant because it was in the news all the time. So essentially the influenza modelling group, which feeds into government. In peacetime, it exists, and it's a group that's linked into the Department of Health and Social Care, and it's very occasional meets, it's planning, it's thinking what we'd need in the case of a pandemic. I was one of 3 academics on that group in peacetime ahead of the pandemic. As the pandemic hit, SPI-M changed confirmation and became SPI-MO, where the O stands for operational. And we moved into a different bit of where we fitted with government. We then became a subgroup of this thing, which Juliet introduced, called SAGE, Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. And I'm going to try and very briefly explain how this all fits together. But anyone who tells you they really understand it really hasn't thought about it hard enough. It's a very odd structure. The UK government has scientific advice built in very deeply. There's a scientific advisor in every ministry, and that's been since the Second World War. It's a very odd system. And then the pandemic changed it again. So here's Matt Keeling's version of how we all connect up. You've got SPI-MO, this modelling squad in the middle. It's got universities, including some of those written in the bottom right corner there. And it's got government groups, which includes modellers like our UK HSA, our Health Security Agency. And there's the devolved governments that are all part of this. SPI-MO is central to what I would see as an academic involved. Then there's the Secretariat, who are civil servants, have to do this translation process of the questions and the asks, and how what we do then connects into policy. SAGE is the next committee up, which then involves our chief scientific advisor, our chief medical officer. There's a lot of observation of what happens in SAGE, and then that's the top end of what I'll ever see. I was sitting on SAGE, but I didn't really know what happens further on from that. So that's the end of the interface from maths to policy at that point. But I have one more slide. So Angela McLean and Graham Medley were the co-chairs of SPI-M. So I have Angela's version of how this all works, which is truly wonderful. And one of the key things to note here is the periodicity. You've got the modelling group feeds into SAGE, via mysterious processes feeds into the guys in top hats at the top, who are the government names that you'd recognise. The Cabinet Office, I don't even know how that links to the Cabinet. And then Cabinet Office to SPI-M, I did see some of those interlinks. But the periodicity was about 1 week. It was really fast, the dialogue between these groups. And that was the thing that I wouldn't have expected a priori at all, is how rapid the dialogue is and how closely academia is involved in all of this, which brings pluses and minuses. Focusing now on SPI-MO, we had over 100 main meetings in operational mode. That means the big sort of 3-hour monsters where we're all at. And there are many, many, many more subgroup meetings. I'd be astonished if it wasn't over 1,000 in the end. The bullet points give the main thing that we are doing. So nowcasting, so things like giving the weekly, what is the R number? What is the growth rate this week? Medium-term projections. If we don't change anything, here's how it might look for the next 4 to 6 weeks. Of course, things did change, usually in response to policy changes. Actually, someone at a talk yesterday described it. It's like the weatherman gives the forecast, which then changes the weather. So odd systems. Situation updates, reports from the subgroup. So I've got a little map there because I chaired the spatial subgroup, which was looking at things in very fine spatial detail, bringing it together from lots of researchers to try and get a consensus view. Topic du jour, whatever the thing was that we were most worried about that week, which was maybe going into lockdown, coming out of lockdown, closing or open schools, the variant, whatever the thing was that we were focusing on because it was going to feed into policy. And every meeting, we produced a massive consensus statement. Here's an example of one here with always this sort of green font and these numbered summary points. It would include things like the nowcasting, and it would include things like whatever the main topic was for that week. So that's what the technical outputs of SPI-M look like. But I thought for this group, actually the interesting thing was slightly the human story of what did it actually look like. Well, there we are. There's lots of us, and colleagues on here will actually realise they recognise probably more people than they realised. We were a real mix of academe and government. And in academe, some of us were in universities and institutions, some specialist modelling groups, mathematicians, more on the biology end, everything. There was a real multiplicity and diversity of approach. So multiplicity in that some things were repeated. So different groups would do a similar task to see if we were going to get the same sort of outputs. And we actively wanted diversity of approach. So I know Graham and Angela were careful to make sure we brought in groups that would, if they were doing something different and interesting, we needed them. There was a real spirit of seeking consensus by enabling friendly challenge. And I'll come back to TMWIW at the end. This is something close to my heart, which I'm thinking about a lot at the moment. How on earth did that work? And I can say there was a phenomenal amount of work done under very difficult circumstances for over 2 years, which I'm sure will be echoed in other countries, just how long and hard work this was. But there we were human beings. Juliet mentioned Juniper Consortium. So again, some pictures of the humans. In 2020, the smaller research groups very naturally coalesced to make a consortium, which Matt Keeling and I became leads of. But there was basically 16 smaller research groups with the co-Is pictured there that immediately and naturally worked together. We're now larger. We've gained some other groups and other universities. But one of the things I wanted to highlight about Juniper, which was unusual, is we had scientific writers built into Juniper officially right from the start. We had Rachel and Marianne, who are part of this story. If I go down, there's Rachel and Marianne. So they were editors of the Plus magazine. They've got experience in scientific writing, and particularly in mathematical writing. They were part of our meetings. They heard what we did, and they could act as an interface to turn it into articles for public, in all senses, consumption very quickly. So public there was everything from school students, the broader public, and also we were clearly writing to make sure journalists had the ideas at their fingertips. They were clearly struggling, but we had the expertise to help with that. And also explainers, for example, the one on R and growth rates was cited every week for nearly 2 years, which is the most we've had a pop maths article cited, I think. There's an example of some articles that are up there. Oh, I can tell you that must have been screenshot around at the end of 2020. I hugely advocate for getting science writing in as part of your consortium, especially if you're involved with policy. These three go together. Latest article, which is close to my heart, fits how SPI-M works. TMWIW is tell me why I'm wrong. So when being wrong is right. This is about how you get consensus in a large group quickly whilst taking advantage of diversity of thinking. You want to have a culture which encourages challenges, and you can get robust and rapid consensus, even if that consensus is that we don't know, by using multiple research groups. But there's an article there, which is Marianne, Rachel worked on that too, and they interviewed Graham Medley and I for it. But that's the latest example, happens to fit this talk. There's one point in time which I think there might be the most to learn from the UK approach. And it was this period of spring 2021. So on that plot of cumulative deaths, which I find really uncomfortable looking at still, Juliet, you see the UK was a line just doing its own thing. And we can discuss whether we were measuring differently, but it was doing its own thing. There was a flat bit. That was the beginning of 2021, when there was a lot more interaction between the scientific advice and policy. This is the document on the government website on 22nd of February, spelling out the roadmap. There were 4 steps. There were 5 weeks apart. The first one is a little complex because it's a sort of phase 2-step first step, if that makes sense. It specified what restrictions would be lifted at those times. And it also specified what checks needed to be in place before we could go ahead with those steps. A bit of forward planning. The rhythm was 5 weeks, and you can think this through from epidemiology point of view. To be honest, I think SPI-M were pushing for 6 weeks. I think Cabinet Office wanted 4 weeks, and we ended up with 5 weeks. You have a step of unlocking. Transmission rate probably increases over the period of a few days. You need a few disease generations to see what that's done to the growth rates. You need a few more days for the data to come through. You need ideally more than a few days of that to be able to get a growth rate. At other end, the next day of the not before 21st of June, government needs to announce the decision a week before on what they're doing, which means the decision process within cabinet needs to be happening the days before that. You need those 5 weeks. You can't do it unless 6 would have been more than 20% better. It would have been much more robust, but that wasn't politically going to happen. And I often get asked, do we feel that we are listened to as modelers in the UK? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Here's an example of yes. Sorry, there's the blurb about the unlocking. There was public clarity on what was needed before each step happened, an agreed set of checks. The wording was, at the very last step, like the others, was not before 21st of June. There's the SPI-M consensus statement from Wednesday, 9th of June. And you can see then we had a pretty good picture of Delta coming into England. And as England, it was most clear. We could then do a bit of forward projection and then make quite a firm statement saying, however you cut it, a delay will really help things. It'll get more vaccine out. It'll push us into the school holidays. Even 2 weeks will have a significant effect. That's very carefully chosen wording. But 4 weeks is really what you need. That was from a modelling committee one morning on the 9th of June. It went to SAGE the next day. I suspect it was in Cabinet Office that afternoon. And there's BBC News from 14th of June. Lockdown restrictions are going to be delayed for 4 weeks. Were we listened to then? Yes. Was there a huge public outcry? Of course there were people unhappy, but there had been expectations set up of this was only if these were okay. And there was clarity that it was delayed by 4 weeks as opposed to forever. So that was a time when I think we got it right, the dialogue with science and policy. And maybe there's something useful in that. Just for completeness, I'm not sure what you can do with links from these without pausing and screen grabbing. But the government papers are all there, including every SPI-M consensus statement. There's lots on Juniper and Plus, and there's a little extra plug for, you can see I had fun with that When Being Wrong is Right article. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Julia. really interesting perspectives on the UK experience, and we will get more into that into the discussion later on. But now I'm going to hand over to Lona to introduce the next speaker.
Yes, and Viggo, if you put your slide set on. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce my close colleague, Viggo Andreasen, who used to sit in his office and model away for 30 years on mathematical modeling. And all of a sudden, he became a media darling in Denmark and has really done a fantastic job in terms of bringing to people here what really was happening, how you can understand R0. And he's been on TV interviews and what have you a million times. And really the thing, what came out of this is like every Dane was able to hold a conversation about R0 around the dinner table. So it's quite a feat here going on. He's an associate professor of mathematical epidemiology at Roskilde University and a founding member of the Epidemics Center of Excellence that we are starting here. He studied the evolution of viral diseases and in particular influenza drift and the pandemics. And he's also, in addition to telling the people what was going on, he's also served on the expert committees around the National Health Board and to the government, and has really helped a lot with the prospects about how to keep the pandemic under control here. So Viggo, over to you. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Lone. And thank you for the nice picture. Let me first comment very briefly on Juliet's presentation and just say Denmark is a much smaller country with less than 10% of the UK population. And in terms of numbers of epidemic modelers, we're probably less than 10% of the UK. So our organization was not nearly as advanced, but actually probably faster than you described from the UK. But what I thought was that I would first describe briefly how the corona pandemic and the mitigation of the pandemic played out in Denmark during the first year and a half. This is the period before vaccines were rolled out, because that's important for understanding how we approach the modeling. So the initial response in Denmark was a lockdown announced on March 11, quite early in a European context, and taking effect a couple of days later. The motive for it is nicely illustrated by our Minister of Health, who's holding this placard in the top left picture, showing a red curve, which would be what would the epidemic look like if we didn't lock down, overwhelmed hospital capacity. Now, if you are capable of making the epidemic progress more slowly, you would get the green curve, keeping us under hospital capacity. So this was the motive. And within a couple of weeks after the lockdown was imposed in Denmark, it became clear, if you look at the right top picture, that that our lockdown was overachieving in the sense that we didn't just delay the epidemic, we could actually stop the epidemic, and number of cases, especially number of hospital cases, were going down. So now we were in this situation that we had to decide, what do we want to do? I mean, the country was locked down. This was not a state that we could keep forever, but what was the strategy going to be? The strategy of the Minister of Health didn't look quite as appealing once we got a little more data. Lone and I made a calculation where we realized that if we imagined that we kept the epidemic at exactly the right level, so we always would have the hospitals filled to capacity, the green curve would take us over a year to achieve. So that wasn't really a possibility. The other strategy that was discussed and available at that time was the one illustrated by the bottom left figure, that of the WHO, inspired of the successful control of SARS-1 10 years earlier. Lockdown, test and eradicate the virus until your country is completely free of disease. And then what he didn't say was seal your borders to the rest of the world and impose draconian quarantine measures to keep the virus from re-entering. This was the zero COVID strategy that was applied successfully by, for instance, Australia and New Zealand, but it wasn't really available to us in Denmark because we're part of the EU and we could not possibly seal our borders. So we had to come up with a strategy that would at any time be robust to the virus being present in the country. So what we could come up with was we have to at any time prevent the epidemic from growing. We had to keep R naught under 1, as you would say in this audience. We are not going to aim for herd immunity because that's too painful. So what we're going to look at is that over time we can replace restrictions by other measures. For instance, contact tracing, advanced contact tracing may ease things for us. And now with this, what we call suppression strategy, there's some things that get easier. We don't really need to find the last case, which means that we can lax a little bit on isolation and quarantine. But as part of this package, you want to keep incidence low, in part because there's no point in people getting sick if you're aiming for herd immunity, or if you're not aiming for herd immunity, but also because contact tracing, for instance, works better if you have low incidence. Part of the strategy would be intensive testing to spot for signs of growth. And finally, a little bit new to me at least, was that we also imposed monitoring of the public opinion. Fortunately, a professor of social science, Michael Bang-Petersen, had just received funding for a project where he would every week take a survey to ask people how they felt about our COVID policy and if they were complying with the restrictions. So this was the basic idea of the suppression strategy, and it sounds really fancy when I describe it like this. It wasn't spelled out quite as nicely by the politicians or by the public health people, and I think that was probably our main mistake in the entire handling of the pandemic, that we didn't spell out what was actually the scope at this point. This suppression strategy, I think most of Europe, at least most of the Scandinavian countries, adapted it over the next couple of weeks. But the suppression strategy worked quite well. If you look at the first couple of years of the Danish corona pandemic until vaccines were available, the first year we know that about 2 or 3% of blood donors seroconverted, and in the second year, 5 or 7%, a total of 5 or 7% of the blood donors had seroconverted. So we had no susceptible depletion in Denmark. And that's important for our thinking of what kind of models to work with. So what are the kind of mathematical modeling that you would like to do if you are using a suppression-like strategy? Here maybe I should go a little bit into the organizational issue. Right after the lockdown, the Danish equivalent of the Center for Disease Control, that's the SSI, formed a modeling group of essentially all mathematical epidemiologists in Denmark. That's a pretty small group, and asked them to start working on models. And the first model we came up with was, of course, a projection SIR type model, and it was used to answer questions coming from the political level that would ask, what do we really need these restrictions? What if we lifted the restrictions on shops being closed, for instance? What would that do to the epidemic? And we had very little data, so the way we did it was that we had tried to guess how much to adjust contact rates in this situation, and what would that do to our projection model. And the result was not very impressive, part because we didn't have any data, but also because with the projection model, you eventually end up always predicting an epidemic. And this was really not what was going to happen, because we all knew that we would stop the epidemic before that was going to happen. So I think it was a little bit unfair to the modeling effort and the way we worked, that this ended up sort of in bad standing. People didn't really believe us for good reasons. So one thing you have to realize is that for our needs in Denmark, the projection SIR type models that focuses on building up of herd immunity doesn't really work very well. But there are many other things you can ask. A member of our group, Kim Snippen, and co-workers, among others, Simonsen, studied how large gatherings combined with super spreading, as we saw with the early variants of corona, worked, and realized that the large gatherings had a very large effect on epidemic growth. So this was really a key component of our control of the epidemic. Another issue that we studied in Denmark was the relation between test intensity or test rate and the actual incidence of the disease. As I'll show you in a second, we kept on increasing the amount of testing that was done in Denmark. So when we saw an increase in incidence, was this a true phenomenon, or was it a phenomenon that had to do with our testing effort? I'll talk a little about our modeling of the use of antigen test and mass testing in a second. Another issue that we looked at was the effect of very local lockdowns at the level of technically a parish, which would be 5,000 to 10,000 people. How did that play into the control of the epidemic? And I'll show in a second how we used modeling to understand variant transitions, and especially how to communicate about variant transitions. And finally, we studied also seasonality of disease transmission. We're so far north that seasonality in disease transmission is really significant. So that was really important for us. But let me move to the situation of what happens to a variant transition. So let me take you into what was happening in the last days of December 2020 in the video meetings between the government health authorities, the modelers, and other experts in infectious diseases. Denmark was at that time experiencing an outbreak of corona, or we had just had one in December. We had imposed more restrictions, and we were just over the peak of the incidence curve showed to the top left. About a week over the curve, it was clear that the epidemic was rolling back in response to the increased restrictions. But in the western horizon, we had dark clouds because in Britain, they had discovered this new variant. At that time, it was called B.1.1.7. It's what's now known as the Alpha variant. And we knew from our testing that it was present in Denmark. The blue bars actually show the number of cases we found, and the red bar shows what we would expect to find if we had sequenced all positive cases. So clearly, the B.1.1.7 was in exponential growth, although starting at a very low number. It's pretty clear what's going to happen when you have a situation like this. And if we were in doubt, we could consult a preprint from Walls et al. That we had just received from Britain. I'm showing here the graph for the Oxford area. Britain went into lockdown in week 45. And the top fat curve shows how incidence immediately started declining. But after a few weeks of this lockdown, the curve goes back up again, and the explanation is the yellow curve at the bottom, showing the frequency of the alpha strain, the B.1.1.7 strain in the area. So what we were looking at in Denmark was that we could expect to see a scenario like this. How to model that? Well, we decided on a very simple model because we had very little data, and I don't think I need to go through the model. You can see it at the bottom left. It's just two exponentials, one growing and one decreasing. And if you look at the bottom right, you can see the curve that you can get out of this if you start with a large number of the Wuhan strain. And you see the yellow curve that gives you the impression that you would have in the public of a declining incidence and then suddenly an increase due to the fact that the red B117 is taking over. So in order to maybe not avoid the introduction of or the epidemic of the alpha strain, but at least delay it until later in the spring where vaccines would start coming available, we would like to impose restrictions that would push down the growth rate of the red curve. And this was in analysis, not much more advanced than this, was then presented by the public health people to the ministry. And within 3 days after our discussion of this, the Prime Minister appeared on TV and announced that in spite of the declining incidence, we needed to increase restrictions. Our social science professor told us this is going to be really, really hard because people are tired of the restrictions. They see incidents going down. You really have to be very clear in your communication of why do you do this? What's the purpose? And Lone mentioned that I'd been on TV quite a few times. This was one of the occasions where I really was on TV explaining exactly this argument, explaining how the red curve here would, that if we could delay the red curve so it would start swinging up later, we might get into the early spring before we had a problem with the alpha, and that in itself would help us a lot. Okay, so, and if you look at the top right curve, you can see that the incidence actually went down and then started a little bit increasing as predicted, but very slowly. So we were really fortunate with our control here. Let me then, as my last example, show you what happened later in that spring. So the last part of the top right-hand graph. At this time, antigen tests had become pretty cheap and available, and Denmark decided to introduce what we called a corona passport, which would say if you could prove show a not more than 3-day-old negative corona test, or if you had been vaccinated, you would be free to move around in society, go to shops, go to school, go to restaurants, etc. So at this time, we effectively replaced a lot of our restrictions by mass testing. There's, of course, a mathematical analysis of this. This is an idea that was picked out of a paper by Mina, and then we worked a little bit more on it. We realized that if you combine Mina's idea with the corona passport, you actually have an additional advantage because you test the most active the most, and that increases the effect of the testing. Also, we combined the testing with contact tracing of those cases that we found, combining even more to produce an effect of controlling the epidemic. At the bottom, I've showed you the number of tests that were performed in the country in this period. And in the middle of the spring, we were testing more than 10% of the entire Danish population every day. And as you may remember from the previous slide, this actually managed to keep the epidemic under control, and this was the way we kept the epidemic under control from April until the vaccine was rolled out in the summer. So the conclusion here is that we were pretty happy with our suppression strategy. It actually worked for us. Contact tracing and later on mass testing eased the need for restrictions. For modelers, we have to say that SIR models were not really informative in our situation where we didn't aim for herd immunity. But mathematical modeling was very useful in management and also in communication, both with the political level and with the general public. But especially if you want to communicate with the general public, you need to have simple, easily understandable models and show principles more than detailed calculations. So I'm going to stop here and end by pointing out that this is, of course, a group effort. So I want to thank the entire pandemics group for their many, many contributions to this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Viggo. That was very interesting. And I would say call it sort of news from a country that really had a lot of precision in terms of data by all that testing and all that sequencing. It was really an unprecedented close view on what was happening. But I can also see that there are members of the SSI forecasting team online here. Maybe we can hear from them in the chat before we start the discussion. So, Juliet, over to you.
Great, thank you, Lona, and thank you, Viggo. The next speaker in this session is going to be Professor Thumbi Mwangi, who is a veterinarian and infectious disease epidemiologist from Kenya. He co-directs the Center for Epidemiological Modeling and Analysis at the University of Nairobi, and also holds positions of associate professor at the Washington State University Paul G. Allen School for Global Health, and he's a Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. His research focuses on prevention and control of infectious diseases with specific programs on neglected tropical diseases, including rabies elimination, as well as a number of other zoonotic infections. He serves as co-chair of the United Against Rabies Forum Working Group on Effectiveness of Use of Vaccines, Medicines, Tools, and Technologies for Rabies Elimination. And he's the chair of the Technical Committee on COVID-19 Modeling that guides the Kenyan government on responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thumbi, if you're ready, I'll pass it over to you.
Oh, many thanks, Julie and team, for inviting me to participate in this LEVERS workshop. And it's a pleasure to talk about the lessons that we learned from Kenya in making decisions on responses to COVID-19 pandemic. Julie provided an earlier slide showing where Kenya was with cases. And I just wanted to mention, so far we have under 6,000 deaths, but also to really note that we haven't had great success with vaccination of the population. We are basically about 20% of the population fully vaccinated and less than 30% having received one dose. Our first case in Kenya was on the 13th of March 2020, which meant we had observed quite a bit what was happening in Asia and also in Europe. And we were, I would say we were quick to respond when we got our first cases here. So from this really nice diagram here by a team from Ken Wellcome Trust, shows when the first ban was introduced for international events and suspension of public events, and that happened almost immediately after the first case came in. I should mention, because I was quite involved in that we offered ourselves to the Ministry of Health to help. And what we found, what we found out when we got to the ministry is that there was lots and lots of people who were offering to help. In fact, it was like a beehive of activity at the Emergency Operations Center. And a lot of the people that came in at the time, the ministry wasn't quite comfortable because, quote unquote, they thought they were like parachute modelers, people offering digital solutions and technologies. And there were so many solutions given as to how you could collect your contact tracing data, who could possibly model for you. And the result of that, I would say, was a bit of confusion and paralysis in making of decisions as to what was the best thing to do at the time. So the very first request that came from the national task force that was formed immediately was to make a projection of when Kenya would expect to see its first 1,000 cases or 10,000 cases. And a few professors from the University of Nairobi had been called in as medical doctors to serve in the task force that the ministry had formed, and looked within the university, are there people who might know how to make that kind of projection? And that's how myself and a few other colleagues were approached. And we did our first estimates showing when we thought, in the absence of any mitigation strategies, when we'd expect our first 1,000 cases, 10,000, sort of give the ministry a bit of understanding of what possibly would happen for the country. And I was really glad to see also Carl and Julie from SACEMA doing similar work, I think, on behalf of WHO Afro, and the results were pretty close to the same. What happened is that after that, the ministry and government sort of started a movement away from just making gut decisions or just using mental models, and thought it should be possible to have choices and decisions based on insights that came from epidemiological models. The result of that was the formation of a COVID-19 technical working group for modeling. I would say it's unlike the UK, where you already had your stage group and groups that had been formed prior to the pandemic. Here we were starting from scratch. Who was modeling? There were a few people from departments of mathematics and the Cambridge Wellcome Trust, ourselves from epidemiology at the University of Nairobi. And we got together and realized that we would give our different estimates to the ministry, and that would somehow be difficult for the ministry to understand what were the weaknesses of each of those modeling approaches, because for many of them, they would not have had a good experience having reviewed, to have reviewed mathematical models and what insights they're getting from them, and what uncertainties might have been associated with those. So we were fortunate because we had worked with the ministry and other and our colleagues had also worked with the ministry for other infectious diseases to come together and have this appointed as a committee that was led by myself as the chair and with colleagues from these different local institutions. There was a bit of an insistence from the ministry that they wanted to hear lots more from the local institutions. For some reason, I think COVID had also created a bit of suspicion everywhere. And what I found, serving in this since the COVID-19 started, is that this was an excellent mechanism for peer review. Whatever we did and whatever our colleagues at the different institutions did, we met every Monday and Wednesday and reviewed all that work before meeting the ministry a day after our meeting to discuss what are we seeing from our epidemiological models. And the other critical thing is that just like Viggo mentioned, for Denmark, even more for Kenya, we had really few epidemiologists or mathematical modelers that could deal with this. So we didn't have, we were short of staff. So it really helped that we were able to target our efforts as different groups in response to the country needs. So if there were requests to think about testing or think about cases in the rural areas, then we could divide those tasks between ourselves and then meet to review what each of us has done and make consideration as to what would be the best decision that the country should follow. How are decisions made? It became quite clear really at the very beginning that we needed to understand and to map how decisions at the government were made. I have put a big arrow here with the modelers connected to the Director General of Health, because that was our main contact person and his technical team. So the people doing contact tracing, those ones deciding on the lab testing, and even him, who would feed his information up to his accounting officer, the permanent secretary, and the Minister of Health. And from the Minister of Health, there was a National Security Advisory Committee that was comprised of ministers of different departments. So like those of education, transport, the whole government, basically. There was a National Security Advisory Committee that was chaired by the Minister of Health. And that is what fed into the presidency, a lot of advisory, whether you're going to have curfews or there was going to be restriction of movement, came from the presidency. And later, after we got used to them, then they came back to the level of the minister. As modelers, we got opportunities. particularly more opportunities to speak with the minister, because the minister would come to the technical meetings of the Director General was convening. And in a few times, got to further explain what you had explained to the Director General and the Minister, to National Security Advisory Committee, and one time when the President was making a big decision that the schools would not be opened, he called a few modelers to stand behind and said they are responsible for closing the country, it's not me. But the decisions were not just on health, they were on opening and closing of schools, whether people should continue going into places of worship. And there were other committees that were formed at the Ministry of Education and the Religious Council that were asked to advise government what it is that they should do concerning education, but also concerning meeting in places of worship. And even those came to the modelers and said, okay, tell us what would happen if we let 40% of people come to church or go to the mosque. What would happen with that? And so the modelers were not only talking to the Director General and his team at the ministry, but also were asked a few times to help other committees that had been put by government. The process of moving information from the modelers and to the modelers through the ministry and to the presidency involved mainly identifying what were the priority questions that the Ministry of Health was interested in, but also the modelers, the group, the technical team saying, we think you should also consider this important question. And then the different groups would do their models, would discuss about what kind of assumptions we need to make, what we need to take care of, and then would come and discuss the results. And from there, often would get a consensus statement of either this is the direction or we don't know. And that would be fed back to the ministry, mainly through presentations. Go and do PowerPoints or whatever kind of presentation and talk through for an hour and a half. And out of that meeting, there will be an extra, say, 1 hour where we would draft the advisory together with the ministry that would then go up to the minister and to the National Security Advisory Committee. So taking the example of is it safe to open schools? And that question was, we really got direct questions like, is it okay for us to open on the 2nd of June or the 31st of August? And if we had a delay, what does that mean? And that was, those decisions were actually the questions, the specific questions were because there was a calendar that the Ministry of Education was following, and they were worried about how, at what point to be able to recover and get a student back to school. And they would have really this kind of very specific questions. And then would also wonder like how many of the teachers, for instance, have comorbidities, and when the ministry asking for that kind of information to know what number of teachers would we be putting at risk, and that became extremely really difficult to find out because those kind of data sets were not in one place, and I'd like to speak about that at the end of this talk. So here's an example of the Kenyan president. Then we have since had a new one, another one, who was talking about, this scientific consensus thing among experts, because he listened, to, people using mental models and those that, had their own opinions, and he actually asked for scenarios like what would happen if we only allowed the candidates to go back to school, and that information was really useful for him and his government to make that decision. And what we learned really here was the great need to be credible and to also create trust, particularly between government and academics. I think for COVID-19, I would say the government was quite clear on what they wanted to do. They wanted to stick with science, and so they listened at least to what it is that the scientists were providing for the country, and that was really useful because that kind of trust was, to some extent, translated to the public. Except that when the issues of vaccines came up, there was a little bit much more difficult as to whether people would take vaccines or not, and that's a story for another day. In terms of the data, the very first things we wanted to know, like soon after we got our first cases, was who was mixing with who. and were people moving in and out of Nairobi and other places. And we approached our biggest mobile provider within the country to ask if they would allow us the identified data sets on movement and contacts of populations in places. And that was not possible, unfortunately, despite the appointments by the ministry and clear mandate, to support government in this. And we found there was a mix of, there's a health issue, but also a security issue, and a bit of the data that came from the mobile phones had already started being accessed by the security persons, because the very initial responses were under forced quarantine. So they needed to know who was where and who had come into contact with who, and then they would make those kind of decisions. And we found that quote unquote militarization of health to have made things a little bit more difficult for us to move smoothly as a country. And that's a really important thing that we have to work on during the peace times. As I come to an end, our biggest lesson is just the gaps that we identified as a country in our current state on what would be required for us to effectively respond to a pandemic like the COVID-19. One, we had big difficulties with access to certain data sets. So for instance, our strategy for Kenya was to keep hospitals at a level where they are able to meet the patient demand and numbers. But then that needed, we required to know how many ICU beds were available, how many of those had oxygen, and that data had to be collected at that time because it was not existing in any data set for that. Which is true even for, like I mentioned, knowing about mobility of people. We ended up using Facebook mobility, Facebook for good data, and Google mobility data. But we thought we would have done possibly a better job had we developed, good relationships with these mobile phone providers earlier on. And the big fragmentation of health data sources, and this we see as an important long-term investment where we know where data sets are, and also we negotiate access long before times of crisis. The other thing is, even though we did this, we are just really few groups, and that has revealed a big need for analytical capacity, modeling capacity requirement for Kenya and the continent. I mean, I speak on behalf of Kenya, and I think we possibly did much better, and possibly were more fortunate than many other African countries to have gotten insights from modeling in real time. And there are really nice papers already showing that there are many countries that did not have this kind of capacity on the continent, and we see that limited analytical capacity and modeling capacity as an important long-term investment. And the final part is we had to learn on the go that how to convert our language of whatever I got for our models into insights that would end up being point form for the minister and for the president to read through as the next actions for the country. And we see that also as a big area, for training, besides increasing the number of modelers, also training on how to share that kind of information. We think of it as a marathon Kenya runs, and that we really hope we can run it fast. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Thumbi. Really detailed overview of a lot of work that was done. So appreciate that. I'll hand it over to Lona to introduce our final speaker.
Yes, and it is a great pleasure to introduce Joe Wu, who is our final speaker. Joe is a professor at the University of Hong Kong in the School of Public Health, specializes in mathematical and statistical modeling of diseases, and wants to develop analytics and strategies for disease control and prevention, and translate these findings into policies and practice. He works obviously on COVID-19 and has published some awesome papers during the pandemic, but also before that, seasonal and pandemic influenza, hand and foot and mouth disease, HPV, MERS, yellow fever, you have it, even cancer. So Joe is the managing director of something called D24H that you could check out. That it does AI technology and focuses on global and personal health protection strategies. And also Joe is a co-editor of Epidemics and plus Comp, and he's a member of the WHO Advisory Committee of Immunization and Vaccine-related Implementation Strategies, amongst many other credentials. Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Lona. Can you all hear me?
Yeah. Great.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present in this workshop. Today I'm going to talk about how our group at Hong Kong U, the infectious disease modeling group, has been using data science to inform government's policy regarding COVID control and response in Hong Kong. I first learned about the word nowcasting from Mark Lipsitch during the 2009 swine flu pandemic. The figure shown here is a more recent version of this framework, nowcasting framework, from a more recent paper of his, which very nicely summarized we as modelers, what we do to translate the surveillance inputs into evidence, including, for example, transmissibility of the pathogen and severity estimates of the pathogen, in order to inform policy decisions. So the playbook that we followed in terms of nowcasting COVID has been summarized in a recent paper that we did in 2021, which you can find here. So it all started in January 2020 when COVID first emerged and spread in Wuhan, China. So the first contribution that we did for the Hong Kong government was to very quickly risk assess the pandemic potential of COVID-19. At that time, as many of you might recall, the official number of cases in Wuhan was only on the order of a couple of thousands. Using a pretty standard SIR model and combining that with international data on the number of exports from Wuhan to other countries in terms of the COVID-19 cases, and also combining that with domestic human mobility based on data from Tencent, we were able to answer three very critical questions that the government needed to know in order to form a response to COVID-19. The first was, of course, the transmissibility of the pathogen, and we estimated that to be about 2.5, so on a bit more transmissible than pandemic influenza. But more importantly, the number of cases in Wuhan we estimated to be on the order of tens of thousands instead of just a couple of thousands, which was the official number. So at least 40, 50 times larger than the official numbers. And that was a big piece of information that the government, that was useful to them, because that gave them an impression of how much underreporting there was. Second, we were able to estimate that even though there had only been a small number of cases confirmed in other cities in China, we estimated that actually dozens and to hundreds of cases have been exported from Wuhan to other Chinese cities. And those cities actually also have ongoing COVID epidemic happening, although it was not apparent yet. And finally, reducing intercity mobility was not going to be effective in reducing the spread of the virus within mainland China, because major cities already have brewing epidemics. So these three pieces of information was useful to mainland China as well as Hong Kong. So China very quickly decided to adopt the zero COVID, dynamic zero COVID policy, basically locking down all major cities in China for 6 to 8 weeks. In the next couple of weeks, we used publicly available information on the internet, for example, in news reports and other scientific preprints on medRxiv, to estimate the clinical severity of COVID-19, which means the proportion of infections that might suffer from severe clinical outcomes, including hospitalizations and death. That piece of information is important because it helps us to assess whether the spread of the pathogen will overload the healthcare systems. So we estimated that the symptomatic case fatality ratio of COVID at that time was about 1.4%, 1.5%. And that was large enough to overload the healthcare systems in any population because the COVID had a reproductive number of 2.5. So if we let it go without mitigation and with this 1.4% symptomatic case fatality ratio, healthcare systems would definitely be overloaded. And the fatality ratio also has a very strong dependence on age. As we now know, elderly people have a lot higher risk of dying from the disease. So again, combining this information with the previous piece of information about transmissibility, that further reinforced the government's decision to adopt zero COVID, both in mainland China and Hong Kong. And that's what we did in Hong Kong for since then. And it was effective to contain the spread of COVID-19 throughout 2020 to 2021. So we had 4 waves of COVID, from the ancestral strain to the alpha strain to the delta strain. And throughout the first 2 years of the pandemic, the cumulative infection attack rate was actually less than 1% based on series survey. However, those dynamic zero COVID policies were not effective anymore when Omicron emerged and spread. We first had Omicron importation in Hong Kong in the beginning of 2022, and because the transmissibility of Omicron was much higher than its predecessor, including Delta, it spread very quickly, even though we again re-implemented all the public and social control measures that we did in waves 1 to 4. Those were no longer effective to contain Omicron, which led the 5th wave in Hong Kong. And during those times, we estimated that the cumulative infection attack rate was at least 50%, again, based on series survey. And that result was just recently published in Nature Medicine article that we can find here. So going back to waves, 2020, during the first 2 waves, one thing that we realized that we need a knowledge gap that we had to fill for the government was that there's a pretty long delay between infection and confirmation. So relying on the observed epi curve, which was based on case count, in order to sort of infer the transmissibility of the virus in real time, was not going to be a good strategy because the government needed very quick evidence on whether its public health social measures were effective in reducing transmissibility. So we were trying to develop a framework in order to track transmissibility in real time so that we can do better nowcast and short-term forecast. And like many other populations around the world, we resorted to digital proxies. And in Hong Kong, we have a smart card called Octopus Smart Card, which is used by almost everybody in Hong Kong for regular activities such as transportations or small purchases in convenience stores or restaurants. So long story short, we were able to show that the Octopus transaction volume is a very good reflection of the human mobility, human activity, social interactions in the community. And the nice thing about this is that these cards could be age stratified based on the types. So we have adult version of it, student version of it, and elderly version of it, which is give us some advantage over other proxies, for example, Google Mobility or Apple Mobility, which are not age stratified, at least not in the version that is publicly available. So that allows us to translate basically the octopus digital proxies into real-time estimates of reproductive number, and that has been very useful for informing the government, the Hong Kong governments, how effective their non-pharmaceutical interventions were. So molecular epidemiology has been a very crucial tool for monitoring emergence of new variants around the world. In December 2020, the B117 variant, which is now known as the Alpha variant, first emerged in Europe, in particular the UK. And at that time, there was the government posed a question to us, asking us to basically risk assess whether this variant is going to be a threat. And we quickly used the publicly available information in GISAID to infer that this Alpha variant was actually 75% more transmissible than the ancestral strain. And we published that information in Real Surveillance in January 2021, I think. At that time, it was one of the first publication showing that the Alpha variant was much more transmissible than the ancestral strain. Although similar information has been it was available in preprint versions. And the Hong Kong government acted very quickly. They banned flights from UK to Hong Kong right before Christmas because they were anticipating a lot of people, including in particular students, might be flying back from the UK to Hong Kong for Christmas. So they made that sort of like difficult decisions in order to buy more time, basically, to get prepared, to learn more about the variant. And the predictions that we made regarding increased transmissibility was later confirmed by two other similar studies from the UK. So that's sort of give you a glimpse of what we did in the first 4 waves. And then, like I've mentioned before, we had a huge 5th wave in 2020, which was caused by Omicron. So basically, we again use our modeling to try to do nowcasting forecast throughout the Omicron wave in Hong Kong. At the beginning, because Omicron was all novel, across the world, in particular in Hong Kong, we could only rely on overseas parameters in order to do the nowcasting forecast. In particular, we need to rely on overseas estimates on the infection fatality ratio. Based on the model, we estimated that even the most stringent PHSMs that we did in wave 1 to 4 would not be able to contain Omicron. Even with the most stringent one, RT will only be suppressed to 1.3 to 2, which gave the government a heads up that we won't be able to suppress the spread unless we implement lockdown for a very, very long time. Which was not what the government chose to do. The government chose to mitigate the epidemic instead of implementing lockdown, in which case we estimated that the Omicron epidemic would peak around the 1st to 2nd week of March 2022. And that eventually turned out to be quite accurate. But unfortunately, we did very poorly on estimating the number of deaths. Although we had the right prediction on the timing of the peak, we severely underestimated deaths by 2 to 3 times. And that was because first, at the beginning, we didn't have local estimates on infection fatality risk. In order to get an accurate estimate of the number of deaths, we were relying on overseas estimates. And second, antivirals became available in mid-March. So right at the peak or shortly after the peak, and that has severely changed the infection fatality risk because of the effectiveness of those antivirals. But at that time, we didn't have much information on those effectiveness. There was a lot of uncertainty in how effective they were in reducing hospitalizations and deaths. And finally, the vaccine uptake rate among the elderly, particularly those who were residing in nursing homes, were much lower than we expected. And at that time, there weren't very good information on the vaccine coverage among that particular group, which had a particularly high infection fatality risk. Because of that, we asked the different government agencies to provide us these data in order to fill the data gap. In addition, we look for other data streams in order to help us to better calibrate the model to the data, including sewage wastewater surveillance, which has been widely used in many different populations to track the ups and downs of the viral activity, and also the death data, which is not the kind of data that will be routinely collected in the clinical setting, because we have been underestimating deaths by substantial margin. We made a strong urge to the government that we need the clinical colleagues to gather these data in real time in order for us to do better nowcast and forecast to inform government's policy. So this wasn't routinely done even during the first 4 waves. This was particularly done by our clinical colleagues during the 5th wave, which took a lot of work. So eventually, we estimated that about 70% of the Hong Kong population have been infected by Omicron, and that the number of deaths by April 30th hit about almost 10,000. So these are some lessons learned for the first 3 years of COVID-19 nowcast and forecast that we did. First, robust nowcast and forecast requires local data. So as I have mentioned, during the 5th wave, the Omicron wave, we did very poorly on death estimation because there weren't enough data to inform the infection fatality risk. Second, models should make the best use of available data sources with a thorough understanding of the bias, imprecision, and uncertainty in each data stream. In particular, the number of case counts is not a good reflection, or not necessarily a good reflection of the actual transmission dynamics, because of underreporting, because of testing capacity, and many other reasons, which when we communicate this to policymakers in the public, many of them don't get it, at least not in the first round. Effective communication of epidemic intelligence requires a good understanding of model assumptions and uncertainty, not just on both sides. So not just from the side of the person, from the person who is providing the intelligence, but also on the receiving end as well. Fourth, policymakers and the public expect and actually oftentimes demand accurate point estimates from epidemic nowcast and forecast. So for example, at one time we were estimating that the epidemic would peak in the first 2 weeks of March, and when people were not seeing this, in the first week of March, they would then some of them would start criticizing that our work was not accurate, etc., because they were expecting basically very, very high precision estimates, which as modelers we know is not always possible. And finally, preparedness is the key. the epidemic timescale of most pandemic pathogens, including COVID-19, is just too fast for effective nowcasting and forecasting in the absence of preparedness. So that's all I would like to share with you today. Finally, I would just like to acknowledge the team in my school who has contributed to this work, and also the different government agencies and also the funders who support our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe. This is very interesting. This ends the presentation round for the 4 speakers, and we go to the panel discussion, in which Juliet and I will try to hit you with some questions to start some interesting discussions, and also we'll pick from the questions that you have posted on the chat. You can still do it, it's not too late. Put your questions there, not too complicated, so we can get it quickly. I would like to start asking you, Julia. I loved your metaphor about the weather forecast. You make a model and then it changes the weather. And I was wondering, and also looked at your graph in forecasting, it's a very wide confidence you have on the predictions. How did you go about communicating this and to really make the policymakers or people believe this was the right thing to do when you came up with the policy changes that were needed, like extending the lockdown by 4 weeks?
Oh, there was also a question in the chat about how you communicate risk.
Yeah, I'm picking up on several questions about uncertainty in the chat here.
Yeah, it's the uncertainty. It matters who you're communicating with, right? So when we're talking within SPI-M, we talk as we would to our colleagues at a normal workshop, using our own language. That turning it into the SPI-M consensus was actually the SPI-M secretariat, and actually it was a member of the secretariat, Tom Irving, who made that wonderful comment. It's like you forecast the weather and then it changes because of that. And his talk is actually linked in that Newton Institute link. It hasn't gone up yet, but when it does, I really recommend watching that talk. What was the title of it? It's perfect. Challenges in communicating the results of SAGE's COVID modelling. And the kind of issues we hit were, if we would put out something verbally or in a thing where, you know, the range of deaths is from this to this, you know which number the newspapers are going to pick up and run with. And then, you know, later the public say that upper bound didn't happen, therefore I no longer trust anything you do. We had a phase where the Secretariat recommended not including the central estimate at all. So they can't latch onto one figure, or to include all 3 figures, the lower bound, the central estimate and the upper bound. Just say, look, you've got to think about all of these. If you're going to take one, it's obvious you take the centre. You can't just conveniently choose one from each end. But it was tricky. That's thankfully, we didn't have to do it all. A lot of the Secretariat were thinking about what's going from SPI-M to the public. And then when we're communicating as scientists, independent scientists, we had PLAS magazine and other local expertise. It's really hard to have this headspace to think about this is being listened to by the public, it's listening to by journalists who have their own agenda. I commented in chat, there can be willful misinterpretation of uncertainty to suit whatever agenda someone's trying to push in whatever direction. So it's different to normal maths communication, right? It's not that we've just got it a bit wrong. It's like we're trying to get it wrong. But things like combining the estimates to give projections, using those broad coloured plots was one way, but I'm not sure it always got through to the right audience. We're still really puzzled about the best way to do that, but there's some of the thoughts.
Very cool. And here's a question from someone posting. This is Catherine Perez posting for Joe. Can you talk about some of the biases you faced when working with data at the onset of the pandemic versus the data you work with today?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, one of the most important bias that we have to deal with throughout the entire pandemic is what I've mentioned earlier, underreporting or estimating ratio, due to human behavior, due to testing capacity, etc. So at the beginning, I think when most people were worried about the the disease, and there was substantial testing capacity, we could during the first wave 1 and 2, we could count on the confirmed case count as a pretty robust reflection of the actual epidemic curve. But then, of course, we still need to adjust for the delay between infection and confirmation in order to recover the actual transmission dynamics. But that was no longer possible for wave 5, the Omicron wave, because there was just too many cases, too many infections. Testing capacity were overwhelmed, and actually the government switched it midway. At the beginning, they were only taking PCR confirmation as confirmed the cases. Midway, they also accept RAT, rapid antigen test results, as confirmed the cases as well, because there were just too many people needing PCR testing. So in that sense, the confirmed case count was no longer a good reflection of the epi curve, and therefore we had to look for something else. And that's something else was what I mentioned in my talk, sewage surveillance. So it turns out that the viral load that we were able to detect at various sites in Hong Kong, across the entire Hong Kong basically, was a very, very good reflection of the prevalence of the disease in Hong Kong. And actually, we are now strongly advocating the government to continue doing sewage surveillance, not just for COVID, but also for other diseases, including flu, RSV, etc. And hopefully that will become a very useful data source for surveillance of many different pathogens.
Thank you. I think that in your presentation, you gave a very good reason for the exit strategy that you did in Hong Kong, noticing that there was no way you could stop the Omicron. It was just too rapid spreading. So that gave me a question I had before this. How did you actually, on what grounds did you make this? I hope I got that right. But I was wondering, Thumbi, in Kenya, did you have some similar thinking about how would this end there? You have very few deaths, yet you have a really high zero conversion rate in countries like Kenya. I don't know if it's also true for Kenya, but you think most people had gotten infected, or what are you thinking, and how do you think this will end? And I'm thinking, I mean, this is relative to the prediction of utter disaster that WHO made for Africa in the beginning of the pandemic. How do you see it now? How does your country see this now going forward?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think the main thing was there wasn't much we could do to some extent, because for instance, I had Viggo talk about testing 10% of the population at some point. The very best we ever did was 0.01% of the population at any single time. So testing wasn't great. Except that when we did a zero surveys, we found early on, up maybe by November of 2020, that we had gotten over 70% of the population already exposed, and that number had not translated into the catastrophe that I think had been predicted for Kenya and for the other countries. And indeed, even our very own first initial models that are calibrated using data, from China, before we got our first cases and started seeing what was happening in that population, would have made that kind of big estimates. But we updated them quite quickly when we started getting cases in and seeing what was our case fatality rates, and also seeing that I think we had a youth dividend and we had a lot of young people, and that was not going to be as big an issue. So the strategies then that we employed were very much looking at what have we got in our hospitals in terms of patients in ICU, and if that number is going near the capacity we have got, then we'd tighten the restrictions, and if that was going down, then would lift them. our lockdowns were not like full lockdown where there's absolutely no movement. We actually had partial lockdowns, which are quote unquote curfews. So we let people move during the day, but at night when we thought there would be a lot more dangerous contacts, like in pubs and people enjoying themselves, and that there was a bit of restrictions for that. And that was our approach. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Juliet, got some questions?
Yes, sure. So I'm gonna first start with this question from Madhav in the chat. He asks whether you can comment on the role of the socio-political layer on the modeling. So the role of things like misinformation, political considerations, compliance, and such. And I think perhaps I saw Julia granted that. I'm gonna put that your way first, but then we can have others comment if they'd like to chime in.
Well, could I comment? I could rant about it for days, but I won't. The political considerations in the UK was very volatile in 2020. We had a prime minister of, shall we say, completely polarized popularity. We were going, it was the time of Brexit, and we had a really fractious political, that website I had a screenshot of at the bottom had COVID-19 as one tab and Brexit as the other. It's like a completely unholy choice. It's a bumpy time. And we had a political advisor, Dominic Cummings, who was particularly divisive character at that time. And then the science and the modelling and SAGE sort of got bundled in with that, which was completely perplexing to those of us involved. So we suddenly became seen as political objects, and that was really tricky. In terms of our roles, the first thing that changed was everything that SPI-M did and SAGE did, the papers went out public, right? So you want direct information, not third hand or leaked. So the SAGE public papers going out public, the SPI-M consensus statements, which had been worked on late Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, went out public on Friday, just to get that direct flow through. But in many ways, as SPI-M modelers, we just had to put it out of mind, right? And just get on with our jobs and focus on the most important communication we can do is to SPI-M, to SAGE, to make sure our chief scientific advisors have the best information at their fingertips. And I'm not saying it was easy to put the political stuff aside, but we also tried very hard to play everything with a straight bat. We might have a personal view on what we think the government should do, but we have to just try and present things as straightforward as we could. And this was in the context of when the Prime Minister is saying things like, we're following the science, which, what does that even mean exactly? Right. No. So it was a strange time, but we tried to focus on what our roles were. And as I say, later on, we got the plus writers in so we can communicate as scientists to the public and science communication in a more expert way, and had people who could think about that. That's a mini bit of the rant. There we go. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. Would anyone else like to come in on this point?
Yeah, I could quickly. I think that the one I got quite clear was like decisions on travel restrictions international. So I remember, for instance, when we got Omicron and there were, that we possibly should be locking out South Africa. And the modeler said, well, I don't think it's possible to lock out any country, any travelers from a certain country and keep Omicron away. And in one of the pictures I was showing in my presentation, there was a reaction, for instance, one time to the UK travel restrictions having put Kenya on the red list. So at that point, it was not so much what, the modelers were saying, but exactly what other governments had done. And the restrictions that were put after was more the political things. So I mean, it was really interesting to see those kind of things, that sometimes it's not so much what your modelers are saying, it's what the political situation is like and how countries should treat each other.
Thanks. Yeah, so you raised, Viggo? Sorry,
I was just going to say, I think we had a much more broad consensus on our handling of the pandemic in Denmark. If you ask this sociology professor who was monitoring people's view on it, there was a backing of like 75 to 80% of the population at any time for the policy. We probably have more political involvement in the decisions that you would see in most countries, where the government that in principle had a law that would allow it to do whatever was necessary, but in practice, this would be discussed in parliament or in a committee under parliament. So there was a pretty open discussion. And I think that made life a lot easier for us. Lone mentioned my many TV presentations. I think that was only possible because we didn't have as divided a discussion as you had in the UK, for instance. I've had a few mails telling me that I'm a traitor and all that sort of stuff, but that was really marginal compared to what I understand was happening in other countries. But we definitely also had a very open policy from the government and from the health officials. And we probably had a more transparent way of communicating than you would initially have had in many other places.
Yeah, I thought your example of what happened with the alpha wave coming in and how you were able to sort of prospectively explain that to the population and get buy-in prospectively, I thought was a really good example of that. I can't imagine that happening in South Africa. I think our situation was very much that you know, the modelers were asked to share with the government, but that those conversations were very opaque to the public, and that you know, that there wasn't that sort of prospective explanation of this is what we're doing and this is why, and I think that could have been really valuable, but it wasn't in our context, the way things worked. Okay, so there's a question in the chat from Carl Pearson. It says, yesterday had a bit focused on the US perspective and discussion on how local, state, and federal response elements worked together or against each other. The question is, it was within your countries, so the US obviously is a huge country with many different divisions. Some of your countries are much smaller, but the question is, were those sorts of divisions present with or not within your settings? If so, how did that impact on the way that you worked? And were you only responsible for sort of national level policy, or were there more local questions that were being asked of you and engagements with lower administrative levels as well? And how do those differ from the national discussions? Maybe we'll start with Joe. I guess Hong Kong is tiny, so.
Yeah, Hong Kong, that's right. So my response is pretty short. So we don't have that kind of problem per se in terms of, you know, heterogeneity across different geographical locations, because we are a small city. But we do, I think, like, you know, many other places, we do have conflicting interest among different government branches who are responsible for different parts of the pandemic response. In particular, for example, in my talk, I mentioned that the vaccine uptake rate among the elderly, especially those residing in nursing homes, were very low at the beginning of the fifth wave. It was maybe 30% or 40%. And by that time, the vaccine had been available for almost a year. And so when it was eventually realized that, you know, these people were, many Omicron deaths were due to lack of vaccination, then people start to look for, you know, who was responsible for this. and then people start, spending their energy, doing the debate and etc. instead of actually going out and, try to increase the uptake rate among their high-risk group during the fifth wave. So yeah, that's the kind of divisiveness that we had in Hong Kong. Not so much because of heterogeneity across different locations, but conflicts among different parties who are responsible for COVID response. Over.
Sure. What really was the hesitancy amongst the elderly in Hong Kong and China, for example, to not get vaccinated? We've been very surprised about that here. It seems like a good idea.
So just like many other places, there are multiple reasons, but I can name two most important ones. The first is that for the first 2 years, waves 1 to 4, as I mentioned, we were pretty successful at containing each wave. So there was certainly some a substantial level of complacency, especially among the elderly. And second, vaccines first became available in March 2021 in Hong Kong, and as soon as vaccination commenced, the press media kept reporting adverse events following immunization, especially among those the elderly people and also people with comorbidities. So although they didn't explicitly say, in the news headline that vaccine caused these adverse events, but for the elderly, after seeing headlines after headlines on a daily basis about these adverse events after immunization, it's sort of imprinted in their mind that these vaccines are not safe or not yet safe, and they could afford to wait because again we have been successful in containing the each wave. So that I think that those two were the strongest driver for vaccine hesitancy among this high-risk group. Over.
Thanks. So I think we want to wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so, but I see Viggo is keen to add to the discussion, so please go ahead.
Well, we had in Denmark one major conflict over the handling of the epidemic, and that was to some extent geographic, because it turns out that mink is very easily infected by corona and can spread the corona back to the human population. And in Denmark, we are 6 million people, but we were 14 million mink, and they were living in cramped conditions. So corona spread very easily in this group. And it was very clear that the epidemic was spreading through the mink population, and it was feeding back into the human population. And for a while, we had actually 2 simultaneous epidemics in the country. One in the people in the area where the mink production was, and one in urban Copenhagen. And there was a big discussion of how to handle this, and eventually the government ordered all mink to be culled. And there's been a long discussion of whether the government had the legal authority to do that. But at that time, there was clear sort of split in the population as how to handle this. And maybe a little surprising, but people living in the mink area didn't like the idea of killing the mink because this was money. There's lots of money in mink. So we did see that kind of split, and it had a very precise economic background, I think.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, I'm going to wrap up with one final question, which I'm going to ask each of you to just address in turn, hopefully quickly, concisely. So we've heard about 4 very different contexts, 4 different ways of interacting between the modelers and the government, and ways of interacting between modeling groups. And I'd just like to know from each of you, what do you think is the key thing that needs to happen moving forward to ensure that things work better the next time around? There were positives and negatives, of course, in the responses in each country, but I'm sure we can all do better in the future. So let's start with Thumbi.
Thanks, Julie. I think from my experience, we sort of came together almost on an ad hoc basis. What I would think would make us prepare and do a better job next time is not to meet when the pandemic happens again or as such a big outbreak, but to identify areas where we can work together as modelers within the country to address the current public health priorities. And hopefully that prepares to work better, us to work better together when we have next big pandemic or next big outbreak happen in our country. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Joe?
I think a consensus on how much we should be investing in pandemic preparedness. So there was an article written by Peter Sands and Victor Das in New England Journal of Medicine in 2016, I think. Peter Sands was the ex-CEO of Standard Chartered Bank. So he was working with Victor, who was the president of the Institute of Medicine, to frame pandemic preparedness as a pandemic as a global security problem, or if not a national security problem. Compared to the amount of money that we invest in military or preventing financial crisis, the amount of investment that we put on pandemic preparedness is a tiny fraction. It's like less than 1%. But the damage in terms of human loss, life loss, and economic damage, pandemic is much more destructive than, say, financial crisis. So I think we should learn from COVID that we should be investing a lot more, not forgetting. Hopefully, we won't forget the lessons that from this pandemic going forward. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Viggo?
Well, clearly we need to do a little better on preparedness for pandemics. Like every other country, we found ourselves without testing capacity, without even the most basic protection gear against a new infection. I think one thing that may be of use to other countries is that we were fortunate to have very good national registers on microbiological tests, on patients in hospitals, on vaccination, and in general on the population, that we could very quickly feed into the data streams, so that within a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, we actually had a very precise picture of what was happening with a delay of 1, maybe 2 days. And I think that's a kind of preparedness that some countries would definitely benefit from, and would also have be able to enjoy in other contexts than the pandemic. So I think that would be what I would take home from this.
Thanks. That's such an important point, and I think we all appreciate the value of those data streams from afar. Julia, last but not least.
I think I'm going to go for the data as well. I didn't talk about the UK story. A lot of what was planned did not happen at all. And a lot of what worked really well was completely unplanned and winging it, just a few genius individuals just connecting things up in a way that was not foreseen. This is bonkers. It's something we could have looked ahead on and done well. I'm not going to whinge, but I'm going to pick out a thing that was done well was UK HSA's COVID dashboard for the UK. It was a thing of beauty, and it was possible to download the data behind it as an individual very easily. A lot more of this should have been planned, and we can plan it now.
Okay, great. Thank you all. Lona, anything you want to say to wrap up?
No, I want to thank you all. Wonderful 4 speakers here. Thank you for, especially to you, Joe. It must be past midnight where you are. And thanks for everybody who came to listen here and post questions in the chat. And also thanks to the organizers who made this possible at all and made this room for us to have this discussion. I think I got a lot wiser than when I came. Juliet?
Great. No, just want to thank everyone and remind everyone that we do have another session coming up at 2 o'clock Eastern time, and we hope to see you there. Thanks.
Thanks, Juliet. And I just want to thank you both as a lead for this panel. You did an amazing job. Thank you very much to you and the panelists.
Thanks, Aaron, for keeping all this together.
See you.
Yeah.
folks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.